When does a number become a story? How do you communicate data in a way that people actually understand? And why aren't charts neutral devices? Hi, everyone, and welcome to Connecting Society. I'm your host, Shada Kashaf-Tomlins, and filling in for Professor Mark Green is Dr. Holly Greenland, Head of ADR UK Comms and Engagement. Today, we're going to explore these questions with Alan Smith, Head of Visual and Data Journalism at the Financial Times. Let's get into it. Hi, Alan. It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, hi, Shada. Thanks for inviting me.
Alan, we've met before. I don't know if you remember last year at the event at the Office for National Statistics.
That's right. Yeah, it was fun. It feels like a long time ago now. 2026 has been an incredibly busy year, particularly covering news. So yeah, that was a while ago now, it feels.
Yeah, and at that event, you delivered a really interesting and surprisingly interactive keynote, which got me thinking. So, like, in addition to delivering talks on the value of data visualization, you've also literally written the handbook on how charts work, which is, in fact, the title of that publication. So it's clearly a huge passion for you that spans beyond your profession. In fact, you were awarded an OBE in 2011 for your services to official statistics when you were working for the ONS. So I think you're the best person to tell our audience, how do you define data journalism? And also, what is your story? Have you always been a numbers guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, this sort of backstory that I have in some ways. I think if you went back to my university lecturers and asked them to tell you what were my two worst topics, they'd probably say statistics and computer programming, which is like relatively ironic given that I've spent a lot of my time after university working with those two themes. And I think actually one of the reasons why I really enjoyed giving the talk at the ONS event at the end of last year was that, literally just over half of my professional career was spent at ONS working in the public sector, working with official statistics. And then back in 2015, I had this sort of kind of mid-career move into the world of journalism with the FT. And I think what's really interesting about that space is how, I suppose, typically you wouldn't think of a move from central government department to middle of a kind of international newsroom as a traditional sort of career move. But I think what's happening is that sort of fields like data journalism are encouraging sort of unconventional career pathways, which I was very lucky to be able to take advantage of. And that's because I think increasingly, data very often can be the story. I mean, we've come off of the back of, like I say, a very busy news year. But even if you go back in recent years, like it was almost impossible to cover things like the COVID pandemic without having a thorough grounding in what was a data-driven story, and then take on the challenge of how to communicate that and to share it with people. So data journalism really is the sum of those two words, right? It is about taking data and using it for journalistic purposes, but there's a whole lot more to it than that, I think, once you dig further down into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And oh God, the pandemic. We don't want to return to that time. But actually, when we think of the COVID pandemic, the data was everywhere. It was in our living rooms. It was on the front page of news sites constantly. And maybe it was always there, but it felt especially spotlighted during that time. And so I wonder, did the pandemic change things for your team?
Well, it certainly made us even busier. But I'd like to think that we were actually relatively well prepared as a team going into the pandemic, because we had spent a lot of time in the previous years leading up to it. I think transforming our part of the newsroom into an area that really could work with data and work with data relatively quickly We had outstanding data journalists like John Byrne Murdoch, who were some of just the most, popular journalists in the world when it came to the early days of COVID in terms of explaining what was going on. And I think other news organizations were probably a little less confident about tackling what they kind of interpreted as data journalism and what that really meant. And I have a nice example of that because actually towards the end of my time at ONS, I think at one point I was giving a talk at a conference in Australia, and I happened to talk to an Australian journalist who was also talking at the event. And I said, "Oh, do you have, what's the data journalism scene like in Australia now?" And he said, "Oh, we do have data journalism now," he said, "because instead of saying the cat got stuck up the tree, we now say how far the cat got stuck up the tree, And for me, it's relatively amusing because I think, you need to move beyond this concept of that data journalism is just normal journalism, just decorated with a few more numbers, and realize that you're talking about a fairly fundamental rewiring in how that journalism process happens. And COVID was kind of the ultimate demonstration of why that needs to be the case. I think you can't make up your mind about the story and then just drop in some data at the back of it. You need to start with the data.
Yeah, definitely. So is starting with the data what separates data journalism from traditional journalism? Like what makes a great data story?
So it's not even so much starting with data; it's starting with a question, right? So I think if I can kind of summarize it thus, that there's a lot of traditional journalism that maybe starts off with the sort of the hunch or the tip or the sort of the seed of a story idea that's kind of almost then written out, and at the end of that process, someone might look for some figures to back up that story and that hunch. And instead, what we really, I think, mean when we talk about, the purer forms of data journalism is where we're saying, well, actually, let's start with a question. So I'm not going to pitch to an editor the top line to a story because I don't know it yet. I haven't done the research. I haven't answered the question. So increasingly with data journalism, what the pitch ends up being is the question, right? We think readers would be interested in the answer to this question. That's the pitch. Then you go away, do some research, and then write it up and visualize it and so on. And that's a relatively new kind of workflow for a lot of journalists. And I actually think the really interesting thing is, so going back to John Byrne Murdoch, he had this phrase of sort of social science on a deadline, is how he described it. And I think in that sense, it really is quite sort of pseudo-academic in the sense that you're starting with a question that you're testing out a hypothesis and not predetermining what your top line is going to be until you've done some original research of some sort.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely hear you when you say that it is a bit like pseudoscience. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than I think we realize if for those who aren't in this world. And an example I really like to think about is like, I obviously don't know how much you earn and I'm not going to ask, but I imagine if you and I and members of our work teams were in a room with, I don't know, Bill Gates, suddenly we're all millionaires, right? Which of course is untrue. But if you average out the earnings of people in the room and throw in one person who skews the numbers because they're so wealthy beyond what is kind of, the normal quote unquote range, it completely changes the picture. And if you are only reporting on the average, that would be a totally incorrect view of what you're actually looking at. And so when I think of stats and I think of data visualization, I really think of this nuance of how important it is to not lose these really sort of like specific points that collectively give you that full picture. And so I'm curious what approaches you take in communicating, say, more complex or more nuanced stories compared to ones that might be more straightforward, or maybe there is no straightforward story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question because I mean, most people, when you're absolutely right. When people kind of come across figures in the news, more often than not, what they're going to be looking at is averages, and averages can, of course, be very helpful. And we can use things like the mean and the median in nice and useful and interesting ways to frame numbers, right? Like that. It's not like we can say that they're not useful, but I think what we found is that if you only use averages, you're missing out on, what journalists would call the scoop, right, or the real nugget of the story that you're interested in. And I remember a story quite a while ago now that I did with the colleague of mine, Federica, where one of the things that we'd seen on social media was a chart that had gone viral, which was, I think many people may have already seen this, but it's a chart that plots. It's like a time series scatter plot that plots the time series of different countries' spending on healthcare per capita and how that correlates with life expectancy. So you kind of can see for every country over time, they're spending a bit more on healthcare. They're also seeing improvements in their life expectancy, which is probably what you would expect to see. But of course, there's one very big outlier on that chart, which is the US. That's what actually made that chart go viral, which was that the US had gone off on a completely different path to the rest of the world on this chart, spending way more on healthcare and not seeing commensurate improvements in life expectancy. And so for us, that was the seed of the story. We were like, this chart has gone viral. It kind of picks out the US as an outlier. That's not the end of the story. It's the start of the story. Because, of course, the question that you then want to answer is why? Why is it such an outlier? And of course, the answer to that lies in the fact that what you're looking at when you're comparing countries is averages. And what averages do is they can conceal vast differences and inequalities that sit under the surface. And in the case of the US, it was all about inequality in healthcare spending. So the average made it look like Americans are spending lots, but lots of Americans aren't. And so the way that we dealt with this and so on was that we produced a piece which was basically a set of 5 connected charts. The first of which was the chart that went viral. But then you have a narrative which digs down into that and explains to people things that they might not have seen on their social media feeds, which is the fact that, there's this unequal share in healthcare spending, which was actually really extreme. I mean, I think it was something like the top 5% of spenders in the US contribute half of all US healthcare spending. That's how skewed that distribution is. And so that creates something that instantly makes you want to keep reading. I think so you don't try and just stop at the averages just to say, well, the audience can't handle any more than that. Numeracy is not great, so we'll just stick to high level numbers and figures. Actually, people do want detail, and they do want detail, particularly if they can relate to that detail in some way or other. So, can I see my country on that chart? Can I see my area on that map? So, for us, that's a really important part of this, to try and kind of move beyond just simple averages where we can into things that carry a bit more meaning to people.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that chart. I spent 10 years living in the US. So that really drew my attention when I saw that going around on the internet. And I really like what you said around giving people information in a relatable way. I work within the comms and engagement team at ADR UK, and we really focus a lot of our efforts around storytelling. And one of the drivers for this was, I remember years ago when we were developing our first comms and engagement strategy, I came across a fact which I was quite surprised by initially, which said that the average reading age in the UK is between 9 to 11 years old. And that it initially posed quite a challenge for us in sort of how do we I guess, present our research in a way that isn't shutting people out. And so then that caused us to kind of think about looking at the human side of our stories, of our research, making it more relatable. And it sounds like that's what you do as well with data visualization. Is that, are there like approaches or tips that you can share around how to do that effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to be conscious of who your audience are. And I think that's one of the things that even in my time at ONS, we'd started to understand that, if you want to communicate with the general public, you might want to do it in a slightly different way to when you want to communicate, specifically technical issues to topic analysts and experts, for example. Um, and similarly at the FT, I think we, we obviously are a kind of an international news organization, and that brings with it a whole lot of other challenges, which is that, a large chunk of our audience are not in the UK, for example, and a large share of them might not be English as first language. So, but having said that, we know that, on average, and there's that word again, a lot of our readers are, really smart, very well educated, very well qualified. A lot of them are very topic specialist types, and so we're very conscious of that audience aspect of who we're presenting it to, and also even the context within our FT output where we're sharing that. So, for example, I might make sure that if we're publishing a very quick news story about something that's happening, as a part of breaking news, you really probably want your data graphics to be as simple as possible. To be glanceable, to be understandable very quickly, because that's the context that you're presenting it in. But we then might be doing a big, features piece, which has got a lot of analytical content in it, where actually you can make the reader work a little bit more, right? Not to make it more complex than it needs to be, but to make it more rewarding. So, if you spend 2 or 3 minutes on a graphic in that space, we want you to come away from it feeling smarter, right? That you can learn things from it. And then similarly, we have a big weekend audience, which is again different. And not only they might be the same people, but they're no longer working, so they're in a more relaxed, sitting back context, and they want to be maybe more entertained. So even within the confines of the FT, we're conscious that sort of the audience context is going to be slightly different in depending on what that content is. And then also, I think just more generally, the thing that I always sort of tell people when I'm teaching data visualization classes is that you're very rarely broadcasting your information to a completely blank sheet, to an audience that has no prior knowledge or prior assumptions or biases. And so there's a lot in that, which is about kind of how should I frame what I'm doing based on what I think people already know. And that can be part of the challenge, but also part of the fun. What I think I've learned more generally, and there are people who've written about this before, people like Alberto Cairo, is that just because you are worried about your audience's kind of literacy or data literacy or chart literacy, you should be fairly wary of just instantly oversimplifying things, right? Because simplifying things is about stripping information away. And you shouldn't do that first. I think the first thing you should really do is start to think about how can we clarify this? And that might be by introducing some hierarchy into either your written word or into your visuals. Um, and and kind of using things for context rather than, to try and make sure that everything's shouting as loud as everything else. So what that means is, like, take a line chart, right? Like a simple line chart's just got one line on it, but a better line chart's maybe got 10 lines on it, one of which is the one at the front, and the other 9 are there just for context. So that for me, kind of clarity over simplicity is a very interesting sort of concept as well.
Yeah, I really love that idea of contextualizing what you're saying. And it sounds like in the one of the examples that you mentioned, you've got information that is almost packaged slightly differently I really loved what you said there about if somebody wanted to read more or learn more, there is that content that is a bit more detailed, that's going to satiate that interest or need for more information. But kind of, next to that will be a sort of more accessible presentation that a broader group of people can engage with as well. If we sort of mentioned the pandemic earlier on in our discussion, just going to that really quickly, that period of time really highlighted the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And I think that is a huge challenge for evidence generators and content generators and news generators, especially now when we have so much content being produced and AI as well that we're sort of dealing with. So do you have any advice on how to build trust with audiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think trust is a really important word, and it's incredibly important within something like the news industry. And I'm really delighted that at the FT we score very highly on trust whenever it's kind of trust of news brands for kind of reliable information and kind of authoritative content. We score very highly, and I think it's probably no secret in some ways. What's the key to that? It's about picking the right topics, researching and doing justice to those topics in a way that is useful to readers, and that doesn't carry a sort of an upfront skew in what you're trying to do. And then certainly in terms of misinformation and disinformation, we take that very seriously. We have a very sort of, fact checking is an important part in our workflow. And really the value of what we do at the FT is to build relationships with our readers that work in the long term. So we're not really interested in readers who are just our readers for a few weeks or a few months even. We really want our readers to spend years building their careers and their relationships with the FT. And so, that for me is one of the things that actually resonated quite well in my move from ONS, because I know there's a group of people at ONS who feel exactly the same way about their content. So I've had this privilege of working in these two organizations that take that stuff really seriously. And all of the examples that you can kind of quote, which are, the pejorative examples, are from organizations that are just not set up like those two. It's become even more of a problem, of course, because there are now so many more information broadcasters above and beyond the normal news brands and new platforms which are creating their own kind of ecosystems of news and information that are all doing different things. So, I mean, I think the most important thing is be faithful to your own mission and your own sense of what's important, and make it clear to your readers that that's what you're prioritizing. And if you do it well, I think it comes across without you having to shout about it too much, right? Like it's part of the quiet confidence of just delivering the right kind of storytelling. I mean, we have a great relationship with our readers. If they feel that we have done something, awkward or that they have questions about, they'll write to us or they'll post things in comments, because we have comments on FT articles, for example, and we'll engage with them. But I think the vast majority of our readers are very appreciative of the care and effort that we're putting into our data journalism, and I think crucially that we're doing things that they're not necessarily seeing elsewhere.
Yeah, keeping it fresh in a sense, but also staying true to your brand and values. It's a good advice in many contexts. You kind of touched on it already in your response, but what are some common mistakes that you see in data communication and visualization?
I mean, yeah, it is really interesting, this, because I ought to sort of say that the best way of spotting mistakes is by doing some of them yourself. So there's probably things that you learn as you progress. As with any industry, I think there are things that, this word experience that we sometimes look for is really just lots of years of making mistakes and then learning from them. But I think generally the things that I've sort of learned that that have really helped me reflect over the years over the kind of, what would I avoid if I had it all over again? The first of it is definitely education, right? I think I came, like I had a joke about my undergrad experience with statistics and computer programming, but it was really interesting to me. Whenever I run data visualization courses, I always ask people, how many of you have to make graphics and do data storytelling? And everybody puts their hand up. And then I say, right, how many of you have been trained on how to do it? And everyone puts their hands down because, if you're a specialist statistician or researcher, maybe you've been taught a little bit about how to produce graphics for your peer-reviewed papers and the sort of content that you're sharing with your peers, but you maybe haven't been taught about how to communicate more widely. Or if you've come up through like a comms career pathway, you might have spent whole years avoiding anything to do with data and statistics because, hey, you're an arts major, not a sciences major and stuff. So I always felt like there was this missing education space in terms of data and chart literacy that I feel like we need to sort of address at an earlier stage. But then once you're underway in this space, I think there are things that you really do learn pretty thick and fast. I mean, for me, when I tell people, hey, I make charts, they kind of think, well, that's just a bunch of numbers. And that's far from what that is, right? I mean, one of the things that charts definitely are not is just a bunch of numbers. What it is, it's supposed to be, if you take this kind of storytelling word, is they are supposed to be visual narratives of some sort. They're supposed to carry a sort of memorable message. And I think the storytelling word is divisive. I think within the community, there are some people that hate it applied as a phrase because it feels quite simplistic. It feels like sort of bedtime story time. It sort of kind of evokes those sort of feelings. I actually quite like it in the sense that when you think about the concept of a story is supposed to be memorable, right? Why else would you tell someone a story? No one wants to tell the forgettable story. So you want it to be memorable. And actually, for researchers, that's incredibly important because if you're trying to inform decision making, I think that memorability is really important because people are not necessarily going to make those important decisions the moment they see your chart, right? They're probably going to want to have to recall it at some future stage. So all of that's quite important. And what that means for me is when you look at the research that's gone into this space is charts definitely shouldn't be just a bunch of numbers because one of the most memorable things on a chart is the text. So writing good titles for charts that explain to people, what do these show, right? Not what do these lines show? What is the story? That can be quite a brave thing for a researcher to take on because they somehow feel like it's, guiding the interpretation by telling a story. But charts are not neutral devices. Like when you've decided to use a chart to present it to someone, usually it's with a purpose in mind or a goal in mind. And if it isn't, then I'd probably question why you're making it, right? Like these things are communicative devices, not just tables of numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you really sort of touched a really good point there in the complexity of this communication. I remember many years ago, before I joined ADR UK, I came across a researcher who had translated his PhD into a comic book. And I thought it was so cool. And he delivered a presentation on the process of that. And what he said that he did was he collaborated with graphic designers rather than giving them a brief and leaving them to it, because he recognized that he didn't have the artistic skills, but they also needed to properly understand the research to be able to take what is effectively an ambiguous piece of research and turn it into a piece of art that is accessible and not ambiguous as well. And I think that that's sort of like where you don't have the expertise to be able to read the data and make sense of it. It's so important to work collaboratively with someone who does understand it, or vice versa, work collaboratively with an artist or a communications expert who can, package it differently. If we could close this segment by bringing it home to population level data sets like administrative data, what piece of advice do you have for our researchers who are looking to communicate their research with policymakers and practitioners and so on?
So I think that my main piece of advice would be to make what you do user focused and not producer focused. And I have in the population sphere, I have a very, very simple example of this from decades ago, which is when I was doing the very first animated population pyramids that we did at ONS. And I had kind of shown some demonstrations of, hey, look, we can use this new web technology to do these cool interactive animations of population. And when we first had that conversation, I had the team who do population estimates at ONS in the room and the team that do population projections in the room. And they basically said, well, we want one each, one for projections and one for estimates. And I was like, well, hang on, could we not just make one that is kind of backward and forward looking, because that's what readers would want, right? So it's incredibly easy in this world to get hung up on the sort of mechanism of production, right? The fact that there's very good reasons for having separate estimates and projections teams, because there are different tasks involved in producing those things. But when you're a user, you might be interested in the composite output because you want to see something in a form that's easier for you to navigate. So my main advice would be to think about the users, right? Like above all and everything else, think about what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alan, thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Shada. It's been great to catch up with you again.
Really enjoyed that conversation. Holly, what did you make of it?
Yeah, that was really, really interesting. It's right in the area that I love. And it got me thinking about the ways that we're applying some of those principles to our own comms and engagement work at ADR UK. And I don't know if a few of our long-term listeners might have noticed that we've actually launched a bit of a brand refresh this spring. So just from one set of colours, mainly around teal, we've now applied different and distinct colour palettes for each of our nations, which has been a big change. And it doesn't just bring a lot more variety to us, but also it's helping us identify for the users where the data and the information is. So you might see, say, coral for Scotland or green for our England data and information. And that's always growing at the moment throughout this year. So you see a lot more of that applied. And actually, one of the exciting things is when we're looking at data visualization, we're going to be able to use some of those colors to really pull out the most useful and interesting pieces of information for each audience, just as Alan was suggesting, and also be able to show where we've got coverage that actually crosses, say, two nations. So we might combine some of our colours. So yeah, a lot of work going on in that area right now.
Yeah, totally. It's a really exciting time to be working in data research. And who knew it could be this creative? And with that, I'll wrap up the episode. Thanks so much for listening and watching. Make sure to give us a follow on LinkedIn to be the first to see what new creative communications we come out with next.